Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take complex topics and unpack the most important nuggets of knowledge for you. Today we're doing a deep dive into a single fascinating piece of research: baseload electricity and hydrogen supply based on hybrid PV wind power plants.
That's right. This study tackles a really crucial question right at the heart of a future with 100% renewable energy. How do we get reliable power and hydrogen supply, the kind you can count on, every single hour from sources that are inherently variable, like solar and wind?
Right, because that idea of baseload power, that steady, always-on supply that's traditionally come from sources you can dispatch whenever you need them, like fossil fuels or nuclear plants.
Exactly.
Variable renewables are abundant, they're globally available, but they really depend on the weather.
Precisely. And let's be honest, sectors like heavy industry, critical infrastructure, or even just keeping the lights on reliably requires that constant, reliable supply. This study really pushes the boundaries by asking, can only cost-optimized variable solar PV and wind, strictly paired with balancing technologies, deliver that kind of baseload globally? And under pretty demanding conditions, too. It's quite a tough test they set up.
So the mission of this deep dive is to understand this study's specific findings. We want to see what they concluded about the technical feasibility and, maybe more importantly, the costs of generating baseload electricity and baseload hydrogen purely from these hybrid solar and wind systems. Looking around the world and projecting out over time, we'll explore the technologies they modeled, where the best spots on Earth might be, how the costs are projected to change, and what some of the key challenges and maybe eye-opening implications are, all directly from this paper.
Okay, let's dig into this research for you.
Okay, so the fundamental challenge this study starts with is that need for reliable energy, both electricity and hydrogen. Historically, as the study points out, that's meant sources like coal, gas, or nuclear. But those come with significant drawbacks, right? Whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or, waste disposal concerns.
Precisely. Other options like hydro, geothermal, or bioenergy can offer some reliability, but they're limited in where you can actually put them and how much they can produce globally.
Right.
Solar and wind are truly abundant, pretty much everywhere, but their output fluctuates constantly depending on, sunshine and wind speed.
And for a long time, there's been this perspective that variable renewables just, they can't cut it for true grid stability and reliability.
Yeah, that baseload generation from dispatchable sources is essential.
Right, and trying to do it purely with variable sources and storage would be prohibitively hard and expensive.
Yes, that's certainly been a significant viewpoint. But as this study and others like it are demonstrating, the landscape is shifting, dramatically. Well, the costs of variable renewables and storage have just plummeted, and our ability to integrate diverse resources is improving rapidly. The research community is increasingly showing that 100% renewable systems can be technically and economically viable.
So it's possible.
It seems so, using a smart mix of resources and storage technologies.
So this study zeroes in specifically on that strict baseload challenge. They ask, can you provide baseload electricity, BLEL, meaning power 247, 365 days a year?
Every single hour.
Every single hour.
Yeah.
And baseload hydrogen, BLH2, using only variable solar PV and wind, combined with only globally accessible balancing technologies.
Right. They deliberately exclude things like region-specific resources, like hydropower, from their model. They really want to see if it's possible essentially anywhere, just using the sun, the wind, and some key technology.
And they approach this on a massive scale, right?
Oh, yeah. They modeled the world broken down into quite small grid squares, about 0.45 degrees by 0.45 degrees, so pretty high resolution, using hourly weather data for each location.
Wow, hourly.
Hourly. And within each square, they simulated the most cost-effective setup for two main scenarios. There's on-site, where the generation and the demand or storage are at the same spot.
Okay.
And coastal, where the electricity has to be transmitted from a potentially resource-rich inland location to the nearest coast.
Gotcha. And they looked ahead, too.
Yep, using projections from 2020 all the way out to 2050. This accounts for the expected cost declines in technologies like solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and the equipment needed to make hydrogen electrolyzers.
Right.
While assuming costs for more mature tech like gas turbines stay relatively stable.
Okay. And you mentioned key technologies. What's central to their model for balancing things out?
A key player, especially for smoothing out supply over longer periods and bridging those seasonal gaps,
Yeah.
is what they call the power to hydrogen to power system, or PTH2TP.
PTH2TP.
It's essentially taking excess renewable electricity, using it to produce hydrogen through electrolyzers, storing that hydrogen often thought of in places like underground salt caverns, which is quite cheap for large volumes.
Right. And then later, when renewable output is low, using hydrogen-fueled gas turbines, which they assume become commercially ready around 2030, to turn that stored hydrogen back into electricity.
So it's like a big, long-duration battery using hydrogen.
In effect, yes. Especially for those seasonal shifts where lithium-ion batteries aren't quite cost-effective yet for storing energy for months.
And how do they figure out the cheapest way to combine all this stuff everywhere?
They use a mathematical approach called linear optimization. It basically finds the absolute cheapest combination of these technologies: PV, wind, batteries, electrolyzers, hydrogen storage, hydrogen turbines at each location. Given the local weather patterns, the projected technology costs over time, and they even consider a limit on how much land can be used.
A land limit.
Yeah, up to 10% in each grid cell to keep it realistic.
Okay. Before we get to their big findings, let's quickly define a couple of terms this study uses. You mentioned baseload electricity, BLEL.
Right. That's providing power for all 8 and 760 hours of the year, nonstop.
And baseload hydrogen, BLH2. Same idea, but for providing a steady, continuous supply of hydrogen gas.
Okay, and what about full load hours, or FLH? It sounds important.
It is. FLH is a way to measure how effectively a power plant is utilizing its capacity over a year. Think of it like this. If a plant ran at its maximum nominal capacity all the time, its FLH would be 8,760.
Right.
A higher FLH generally means a better resource, more sunshine or more wind. But this study also uses FLH from a slightly different perspective. The perspective of the device that takes the electricity, like an inverter or an electrolyzer.
Ah, okay. Can you give a slightly simpler example of what that means? Why look at it from the inverter's perspective?
Sure. So the study points out that sometimes you might install more solar panels, more PV capacity on a site than the inverter connecting them to the grid can actually handle at any single moment.
Oversizing the panels, basically.
Exactly. The study mentions cases where the PV panels might have, say, 129% the capacity of the inverter. You do this to capture more energy during the shoulders of the day, morning and evening, when the sun isn't at its peak. So from the inverter's point of view, the electricity uptake point is running closer to its own maximum capacity more often throughout the year, even if the panels could theoretically produce more at noon. The study finds this clever design increases the effective FLH seen by the inverter by about 32.5% compared to just matching panel and inverter capacity. It means the inverter is working harder, more efficiently utilized.
Okay, I see. It's about how much of the system's capacity is effectively being used to deliver energy, not just how much the raw resource could produce. That makes sense.
Precisely.
And levelized cost, LCOE, LCOBEL, LCOBLH2.
Yeah, that's essentially the all-in cost per unit of energy produced over the entire lifetime of the plant. Covers building it, running it, maintaining it, financing it. It's the standard metric scientists use to compare different energy technologies on a level playing field.
Okay.
This study calculates LCOE for, just a solar farm on its own. But critically, they calculate LCOBEL and LCOBLH2 for the complete complex baseload systems, including the generation, the storage, and the transmission costs all bundled together.
And financing is a big part of that.
Huge. They factor it in using something called the weighted average cost of capital, or WACC. Their base case uses a 7% WACC, which is a pretty standard assumption, but as we'll see, it turns out to be really, really important.
Okay, so with those concepts in hand,
Yeah.
what did they find about the standalone potential of just PV and wind resources before adding all the storage and balancing stuff?
Well, their maps vividly show that while PV and wind resources are strong in many places, PV is best near the equator and in specific arid or high-altitude regions like the Atacama, Tibet, or the Middle East and North Africa.
Right.
And wind shines in places like Patagonia, parts of Tibet, the U.S. plains, offshore Europe. Nowhere on Earth does a simple hybrid mix of just PV and wind generation reach that target of 1,860 full load hours on its own.
Not even close.
Not for reliable baseload.
Yeah.
You absolutely need those balancing technologies, the storage, the hydrogen systems, everything to get to true hour-by-hour baseload supply.
All right, so the core question this study tackles is, how effective are the balancing technologies they model batteries and that PTH2TP system at getting us a strict baseload, and perhaps more importantly, what does that actually cost?
This is where the findings get genuinely exciting, I think.
Yeah.
The study's maps showing the levelized cost of baseload electricity, the Elfkidel are quite striking.
Okay.
In 2020, delivering baseload electricity is challenging and pretty expensive, especially in regions further from the equator that have strong seasonal variations in sun or wind.
Why is that?
Partly because their 2020 model doesn't fully incorporate that seasonal PTH2TP system, remember? They assume the hydrogen-fueled gas turbines aren't commercially available yet, so costs are projected to be over 300 euros per megawatt hour, VMWH, in many northern regions. Very pricey.
Okay, so expensive initially, but based on the excitement in your voice, I'm guessing costs drop significantly over time in their projections.
Dramatically so, according to this study. By 2030, with the full inclusion of the PTH2TP system and those expected cost declines for renewables and batteries, the LCOBIL at the best sites globally drops below 50 VMWA.
Below 50, wow. Where are these best sites?
Places with excellent combined resources like Patagonia and Tibet show up strongly then. But here's a real nugget. By 2050, costs below 40 VMWH are projected to be achievable across vast areas.
40 euros per MWH. Where?
Most regions of Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, Australia, and much of the Americas. The absolute lowest cost sites they identified in 2050 are projected to be around 31 to 34 VMWH.
And those are in.
Places like the Atacama Desert in Chile, parts of the Sahara Niger, Chad, Libya show up, Somalia, Yemen, Oman. Really sunny and windy spots.
Oh, below 40 VMWH across vast areas is a significant finding. How does the coastal scenario compare, where you have to transmit the power? Does that add a lot?
As you'd expect, the coastal costs are higher initially because you're adding that transmission component. You got to build the lines.
Makes sense.
But the study shows this cost difference between on-site generation and coastal delivery decreases substantially by 2050.
Why is that?
Two main reasons, according to the study. First, transmission technology itself is projected to improve and become more efficient. Second, and maybe more importantly, the generation costs at the source get so incredibly low that the transmission cost becomes a smaller percentage of the total bill.
Interesting. What about baseload hydrogen, BLH2? Is that projected to be cheaper or more expensive than the baseload electricity?
For BLH2, the study finds the costs are actually lower than for baseload electricity in the earlier years, like 2020 and 2030.
Oh, really? Why?
Primarily because the devices that make hydrogen, the electrolyzers, are quite flexible in how they consume electricity. They don't need power every single second like the grid does.
Ah, okay.
And storing hydrogen, especially in large quantities in geological formations like salt caverns, is projected to be relatively cheap compared to the really long-duration electricity storage needed for around-the-clock power.
So storing hydrogen for months is cheaper than storing electricity for months?
Essentially, yes, at the scale needed for seasonal balancing. So regions with excellent wind resources, like Patagonia, look particularly promising for low-cost BLH2, even in the near term.
And by 2050 for hydrogen, what are the cost projections then?
By 2050, this study projects that baseload hydrogen can be produced at costs below 40 euros per megawatt hour of hydrogen's higher heating value. That's VMWHH2HHV.
Okay, what does that mean in terms most people think about hydrogen, like per kilogram?
They note this is roughly equivalent to about 1.58 euros per kilogram of hydrogen, VKGH2.
Under 1.6 euros a kilo. That's pretty competitive.
Very. And this level is projected to be achievable on all continents at the best sites. The coastal scenario is still more expensive due to transmission, but obviously locations closer to the coast with good resources are more favorable if you want to export that hydrogen.
Okay, so the study project's low costs are achievable. What mix of technologies do they find is needed to actually get to that cost-optimized baseload supply? What does the system look like?
The study provides fascinating breakdowns for sample locations. For baseload hydrogen, BLH2, the optimal mix is largely driven by the best local hybrid PV wind resource. It's simpler.
How so?
So a site with dominant solar potential, like they show for Australia, would primarily use PV and electrolyzers. A windier site, like one in Canada, would rely heavily on wind. A place with a good mix, like Argentina, would use both.
Right.
The key is having enough renewable capacity to feed the flexible electrolyzers, and then that cheap hydrogen storage handles the hour-to-hour, day-to-day, even season-to-season variability.
Okay, that makes sense for hydrogen. And for baseload electricity, BLEL, you said that's more complex because you need constant power.
Exactly. For BLEL, the study finds the model consistently favors a mix of both PV and wind generation in almost all sample nodes they looked at.
Why both?
Yeah.
Why not just the cheapest one?
Because combining solar, which is strong during the day, and wind, which is often stronger at night or in different seasons, helps create a more stable, less variable input profile before the energy even hits the storage and balancing systems. It smooths things out naturally to some extent.
Okay, so a better starting point.
Precisely. And then those balancing technologies, the batteries and the PTH2TP system, that's hydrogen storage plus hydrogen turbines, work together. Batteries are key for shorter term, daily balancing, handling fluctuations within the day.
And the hydrogen system.
The PTH2TP system is crucial for longer durations and those seasonal shifts. They also show that hydrogen-fueled combined cycle gas turbines, H2CCGT, are important for providing reliable power during longer calm or dark periods efficiently.
Okay.
And then hydrogen-fueled open-cycle gas turbines, H2OCGT, are used more like peakers for handling sharp, short peaks in demand.
I saw something in the study about a potentially counterintuitive interaction between the battery and the hydrogen system for BLEL. Sounded a bit odd.
Ah, yes. They call it the battery-to-power-to-gas effect. It's a detail, but it's kind of cool and shows how complex the optimization gets.
Okay, what is it?
So, in the cost-optimized BLEL system, you'd think electricity just flows from renewables, maybe to storage, then to the demand, right?
Yeah, logical flow.
But sometimes, for a limited number of hours, the model finds it cost-optimal for electricity to flow from the battery through the PTH2-to-P system, meaning it runs the electrolyzer to make hydrogen and potentially back to the grid via the hydrogen turbine.
Wait, battery to electrolyzer to turbine? That sounds really inefficient. You lose energy at each step.
You do. It seems weird. But the study shows it can be the cheapest overall way to manage energy flows for brief periods.
How could that possibly be cheaper?
Think about it. Maybe it helps avoid building a much, much larger battery that you only need the full capacity of for a few hours a year. Or maybe it avoids building a bigger gas turbine that sits idle most of the time. Or it could help soak up excess renewable energy when the batteries are already full, converting it to hydrogen via the battery discharge rather than curtailing it.
Ah, okay. So it's like using a less efficient tool for a very specific occasional job, because the alternative, buying a much bigger, more expensive tool you barely use, costs more in the long run.
Exactly. It's a fascinating quirk of the system optimization.
That is interesting. So looking globally, what's the overall trend in the technology mix they project by 2050? What dominates?
This study projects a general global shift towards higher shares of solar PV and batteries in these baseload systems between 2020 and 2050.
More solar and batteries. Why?
It's mainly driven by their projections of faster cost declines for those technologies compared to wind turbines. Solar panels and batteries are expected to get cheaper faster. So batteries become particularly significant for balancing BLEL, especially in regions that are dominated by solar resources where you have that big day-night difference.
And for baseload hydrogen, BLH2, same trend.
Not quite. For BLH2, batteries play a less critical role because the system relies more on that cheap, large-scale hydrogen storage to handle the variability. So the technology mix for BLH2 is driven more purely by where the cheapest hybrid PV wind generation potential exists to feed those flexible electrolyzers.
Gotcha. And for transmitting energy in the coastal scenario, what transmission tech do they see dominating for moving all this power?
The study shows that for shorter distances, high-voltage alternating current, HVAC, the kind we mostly use today, is favored. Up to roughly 500 kilometers for BLEL, and maybe up to 1,000 kilometers for BLH2 in 2030.
Okay, standard lines for shorter hops.
But for longer distances, high-voltage direct current, HVDC, is the clear choice in their model.
Why HVDC?
Because it has significantly lower energy losses over long lines, even though the initial capital cost for the converter stations and the lines themselves is higher. For moving power hundreds or thousands of kilometers, the energy savings outweigh the upfront cost.
Makes sense.
And by 2050, as HVDC technology improves further, and especially as cheaper batteries allow more local balancing before the energy even needs to be transmitted long distance, HVDC becomes even more prominent for those long-haul transmission needs.
Okay, so mapping this out globally, how much potential energy are we talking about, according to this study, within the limits they set, like that 10% land use?
It's huge. Based on their assumptions, this study estimates the global physical potential for generating baseload electricity and baseload hydrogen from these hybrid PV wind systems could reach nearly 1 million terawatt hours per year by 2030.
1 million TWH.
Yeah, increasing further over time. To put that into perspective for you, the total global primary energy demand from all sources back in 2017 was around 162,500 TWH.
So the potential is many times current global demand.
The sheer physical resource potential identified by the study is vast, yes, far exceeding current or projected future global energy needs, just from these hybrid systems in suitable locations.
But the really crucial part isn't just the potential, it's the cost, right? And
Yeah.
how that varies dramatically depending on where you are in the world.
Exactly. The cost is key. The study provides cost curves and regional breakdowns that are particularly telling.
Okay, give us some numbers.
For the first chunk of on-site baseload electricity, let's say, the first 5,000 TWh globally in 2030, the costs range quite a bit, from as low as 39 VMWH in regions blessed with excellent resources like sub-Saharan Africa and South America,
Okay, very cheap there.
up to maybe 72 VMWH in regions with less optimal resources or higher latitude seasonality like Europe and Eurasia. Still, not terrible, but a wider range.
And by 2050, does that range shrink?
It tightens and drops significantly.
Yeah.
By 2050, that range for the first 5,000 TWH is projected to be down to 48 VMWH across those same regions.
30 to 48 euros. Wow. And for baseload hydrogen, BLH2.
The costs are generally lower still, as we discussed, starting around 46 VMWH in 2030 and falling to 34 VMWH in the best resource regions like South America by 2050.
So according to this study's projections, these renewable baseload costs are becoming genuinely competitive with, or even cheaper than, conventional fossil fuel sources by 2030 in many parts of the world. That seems like a key finding.
Absolutely. It's a major conclusion. Beyond the raw cost numbers, the study digs into several other factors that really influence these figures, which are important to understand.
Like what?
Well, one is that difference in cost between delivering energy in the coastal scenario versus generating it on-site. This difference basically represents the cost of getting that energy from remote, resource-rich locations to where it might be needed, like industrial hubs or population centers near the coast.
You're right, the delivery cost.
Initially, this transmission cost per unit of energy is almost double for BLH2 compared to BLEL.
Double for hydrogen. Why is that?
It's a bit counterintuitive, but think about it. The baseload electricity, BLEL, is already smoothed out, balanced hour by hour before it's transmitted. You're sending a steady flow.
Okay.
For hydrogen, BLH2, you might be transmitting a more variable flow from the electrolyzers that still needs significant storage and balancing on the receiving end, or you need more balancing capacity like storage at the generation site before the transmission line. Either way, managing that variability adds cost to the hydrogen delivery initially.
I see. But that narrows over time.
Yes, by 2050, this cost difference narrows significantly due to those improvements in transmission efficiency and the falling generation costs we talked about.
They also dive into the impact of that financing cost you mentioned earlier, the weighted average cost of capital, or WACC. You said that was critical.
This is perhaps one of the most surprising and frankly critical takeaways from the study, especially for policymakers and investors thinking about where to build these things.
Why so critical?
WACC acts like the interest rate on the massive investment needed to build these plants. A lower WACC means cheaper financing over the project's lifetime. And because these renewable projects are very capital intensive upfront, you spend most of the money building them. The WACC dramatically reduces the final levelized cost of the energy.
Okay, so cheaper money means cheaper energy. By how much?
The study shows that simply lowering their base 7% WACC assumption globally down to 5% reduces projected energy costs by about 15%, which is significant.
15% just from financing costs.
Okay, but here's the really eye-opening part. They do a case study comparing a country like Germany with Kenya.
Okay.
Now, Kenya has much better solar and wind resources than Germany, objectively, better raw potential.
Right.
But if Germany has access to significantly cheaper financing, say, the study uses an example WACC of 3% for Germany compared to Kenya, where maybe the investment risk is perceived as higher, leading to a WACC of, say, 15%.
Big difference.
Huge difference. The study finds the production costs for baseload renewable energy can actually be comparable or even lower in Germany, despite the worse resources.
Wow. So the cost of money can completely outweigh the quality of the sun and wind.
In some cases, yes. It starkly highlights that access to affordable financing, stable investment conditions, and low perceived risk are just as important, if not more important sometimes, than having the absolute best sunshine or wind resources. Money matters just as much as meteorology here.
That's a huge point. It's not just about where the sun shines or the wind blows, but where it's cheapest to build the systems to capture that energy. That has massive implications for where investment might flow.
Absolutely massive.
What about if demand isn't strictly baseload? Many industrial processes or parts of the grid might have some flexibility. Maybe they don't need power absolutely every single hour. Did they look at that?
Yes. The study looked into that with a concept they call close to baseload. They modeled what happens if an electricity demand only requires power for, say, 8,000 hours a year instead of the full 8,760. A bit of flexibility.
Okay, so like 91% uptime instead of 100%. What difference did that make?
They found that back in 2020, before that seasonal PTH2TP storage system was assumed to be available in their model, having even that slight flexibility could reduce electricity costs by a huge amount, anywhere from 20% to 80%, depending on the region.
80% cheaper just by not needing power for a few weeks a year.
In some high-latitude regions in that 2020 scenario without seasonal storage, yes. Because avoiding the need to cover the absolute worst, most expensive hours or weeks makes a massive difference if you don't have cheap long-term storage.
But does that effect diminish later on?
Yes, the impact is less pronounced from 2030 onwards in their model because the PTH2GP system comes online and helps bridge those seasonal gaps for true baseload anyway, relatively cheaply.
Okay.
But the implication is still clear. Industries or parts of the grid that can tolerate even slight downtime or variability could potentially unlock significant cost benefits, especially in the near term or in locations where seasonal storage options might be geographically limited or more expensive. Flexibility has real value.
A major comparison the study makes, and this seems really relevant today, is pitting their renewable baseload hydrogen against the current dominant way we make hydrogen, which is from fossil fuels using steam methane reforming, or SMR.
This is another absolutely critical takeaway, especially given all the talk about the hydrogen economy. This study directly compares the projected costs of their REBLH2, renewable baseload hydrogen, to SMRH2.
And they include fuel costs and carbon costs.
Yes, crucially, they factor in different natural gas prices, which are often linked to crude oil prices, and importantly, they factor in projected costs for emitting CO2.
Okay, so what's the verdict? How does green hydrogen stack up against gray or blue hydrogen in their model?
They find that in 2020, REBLH2 is really only cost competitive with SMRH2 under very specific conditions, things like unusually high fossil fuel prices and high cost for emitting carbon dioxide, combined with getting that renewable hydrogen from the absolute cheapest, best sites in the world.
So initially, fossil hydrogen is generally cheaper, unless maybe there's a very high carbon tax?
Yes, according to their 2020 baseline, without significant carbon costs being widely applied yet. But here's where the trend over time becomes powerful.
Okay.
By 2040, with falling renewable costs and assuming rising CO2 penalties, for example, their projection includes a cost of 75 euros per ton of CO2. By then, the study projects that REBLH2 becomes competitive with SMRH2 at much lower, more typical fossil fuel price levels.
So the crossover point gets close.
So much closer. And by 2050, assuming a higher CO2 cost, like 150 VT CO2 in their scenario, which is within the range many projections use for mid-century, they project that REBLH2 from the best sites globally could actually be cost competitive with SMRH2 regardless of how cheap or expensive natural gas is.
Regardless, even with super cheap gas.
That's their projection. And that's even before you consider the significant costs and feasibility challenges of trying to capture and store the CO2 from that fossil hydrogen production route, making blue hydrogen.
Right, because SMR produces a lot of CO2. Speaking of carbon capture, they also quickly look at the cost of capturing CO2 directly from these SMR plants versus pulling it straight out of the air, right? Direct air capture.
Right. The study briefly touches on that. It mentions that point source carbon capture, transport, and storage, PSCCTS, basically grabbing the CO2 where it's produced at the SMR plant, is initially cheaper per ton than direct air capture, transport, and storage, DACCTS, which pulls dilute CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Okay, cheaper to capture where it's concentrated.
Makes sense. But DACCTS costs are projected to fall rapidly too. Critically, their analysis shows that simply paying the increasing CO2 emission penalty could very quickly become more expensive for an SMR plant operator than actually implementing the PSCCTS technology.
So capture might become cheaper than paying the carbon tax.
Potentially, yes. However, even with PSCCTS on an SMR plant, you're still fundamentally tied to a fossil fuel source, and you still need geological storage capacity for that captured CO2.
And that storage capacity might be needed elsewhere.
Exactly. The study raised the point that maybe that limited CO2 storage capacity would be better prioritized for unavoidable emissions from other hard-to-decarbonize industries like cement or steel manufacturing, rather than using it to continue making hydrogen from fossil fuels.
So what's their bottom line on SMR versus REH2 by 2050?
Their findings strongly suggest that by 2050, simply producing hydrogen using renewables, REH2, could eliminate the need for any CO2 capture specifically for hydrogen production altogether. Why? Because REH2 would likely be cost competitive with SMRH2, even if that SMR included the cost of carbon capture. Green hydrogen wins on cost and avoids the whole CCS complexity for hydrogen production, according to their numbers.
Okay, that's a strong statement. Finally, did the study touch on any potential value from byproducts?
Wow.
Like when you make hydrogen via electrolysis, you also get oxygen and heat. Is that worth anything?
They mentioned it briefly. Electrolyzers do produce quite pure oxygen and also low-grade heat.
Can you sell the oxygen?
Well, the market for bulk oxygen isn't huge compared to the amount that would be produced if we made hydrogen at massive scale. But yes, selling it could potentially add a small revenue stream, maybe a few euros per MWH equivalent of hydrogen produced. It helps a bit at the margins.
And the heat.
The low-grade heat could also have value, particularly if it's integrated cleverly with other processes nearby. For example, they mention if you co-locate it with certain types of direct air capture systems that need low-temperature heat, it could significantly reduce the energy penalty and cost of capturing CO2 in those systems.
Interesting synergy there.
Yeah, but overall, the study suggests these potential revenues from byproducts are relatively minor compared to the main costs and revenues associated with the hydrogen production itself. It's a small bonus, not a game changer for the economics in their view.
So let's wrap this up. This study, baseload electricity and hydrogen supply based on hybrid PV wind power plants, paints a pretty compelling picture, wouldn't you say?
I would, yeah. It suggests that producing reliable, round-the-clock electricity and hydrogen purely from variable solar and wind, combined with technologies like batteries and power-to-hydrogen systems, isn't just some theoretical concept for the distant future.
It seems technically feasible on a global scale based on their modeling.
Technically feasible, and critically, could become cost competitive with conventional fossil fuel sources in many regions within the next decade or two, especially as technology costs continue to fall and policies hopefully place a higher price on carbon emissions.
It really challenges that older traditional view that baseload must come from dispatchable generation like coal, gas, or nuclear, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It demonstrates the sheer power of combining abundant variable resources, sun and wind, with intelligent, cost-optimized storage and balancing solutions on a global level.
And it absolutely highlights how factors outside of just the local weather, specifically the cost of financing, that WACC number, and the economic or policy impact of carbon emissions, are truly fundamental in determining where low-cost renewable baseload energy can be produced and deployed most effectively. It's not just about physics, it's about finance and policy too.
Indeed. Those factors are just as crucial.
This raises an important question for you listening to consider. If this study is right, and reliable renewable electricity and hydrogen can indeed be generated cost-effectively in some of the most resource-rich but potentially remote locations on Earth, think Sahara, Atacama, Patagonia, how might that fundamentally reshape global energy trade, international economic relationships, and even the geography of energy-intensive industries like fertilizer production, steelmaking, or data centers in the coming decades? Where will things be made if energy is cheap in new places?
A lot to think about there.
That's all for this deep dive into baseload electricity and hydrogen supply based on hybrid PV wind power plants.